scene opens with a subtle air of tension as the train rumbles through the night. The young sailor, dressed sharply in his uniform, steps into the first-class compartment of the Plymouth Express, his polished boots echoing on the platform at Newton Abbot. A porter scurries behind him, carrying a heavy suitcase that seems to have a life of its own. As the porter prepares to place it on the overhead rack, the young sailor stops him with a raised hand. "No, no, leave it on the seat," he says, his voice low and deliberate. "I'll deal with it later." With a smile and a nod, the porter follows the sailor's request, tipping his hat before stepping away. "Thank you, sir," he says with a courteous grin. The train's doors slam shut with a sharp bang, and the commanding voice of the conductor calls out, "Plymouth only, change for Torquay." The whistle blows. The train jerks into motion, rattling along the tracks, as Lieutenant Simpson settles into the empty compartment. Outside, the December air bites at the night, sending a chill through the glass. With a sigh, he pulls the window up. A moment of stillness passes, but then something strange hits him, that smell. It drifts into the compartment, subtle yet unmistakable. He wrinkles his nose, his thoughts drifting to a time he'd rather forget, the hospital, the surgery. Chloroform, he thinks, his mind racing. Without a second glance, he lowers the window again, as if to push the unsettling thought away. Changing his seat, he leans back, a deep inhale filling his lungs as he pulls out a pipe and begins to light it. For a while, he simply smokes, staring at the empty stretch of tracks, the rhythmic hum of the train his only companion. But then, the calm is shattered. Reaching for the suitcase, he opens it, pulls out some papers and magazines, and begins to organize them. The suitcase snaps shut, but as he tries to push it under the opposite seat, it resists. His frustration mounts as the suitcase sticks halfway out, refusing to fit. "Why the devil won't it go in?" he mutters, hauling it out again. He crouches down, peering under the seat, and then a sudden cry rips through the air, loud and unexpected, as the train screeches to a halt. The unmistakable sound of the communication cord has been pulled, the train jerking to an unwilling stop. In a flash, Lieutenant Simpson stands, heart racing, as the mystery begins to unfold before him. The conversation shifts, revealing a chilling discovery. "A woman," says PUO, flipping a page of the newspaper, "found dead under the seat, stabbed through the heart." His voice takes on a dark edge. The body was discovered by a young naval officer, Lieutenant Simpson, returning to Plymouth. He stopped the train immediately. The details unfold like a thriller. Her identity unknown, her life cut short. And then PUO leans forward, eyes narrowing. The woman, she was someone important, the Honorable Mrs. Rupert Carrington. But wait, there's more. You see, before her marriage, she was Flossy Halliday, daughter of the infamous steel magnate, Old Man Halliday. And now, he's sent for you. The mystery deepens. What's the connection? "Ah," PUO continues, a glint of recognition in his eyes. "I did a little service for Old Man Halliday once. You remember the bearer bonds scandal? And then there was that Parisian affair with Mademoiselle Flossy. Trouble, my friend, the kind of trouble only money and romance can stir up." He pauses, his voice thick with intrigue. "She nearly made a disastrous decision. An adventurer, a man of dubious intentions. Luckily, her father intervened just in time. He brought her back to America, away from the chaos." PUO leans back, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I haven't heard much about her after that, except that she married the Honorable Rupert Carrington. But from what I gather," a sly grin forms on his lips, "Carrington was no knight in shining armor. He was a man who bled his fortune dry on the turf And Halliday's money, well, that came just in time to save him. Sounds like a love story with a twist, doesn't it? There's a sharpness in Puo's voice now, the final piece of the puzzle sliding into place. I've heard whispers. Legal separation, perhaps. Old man Halliday isn't a fool, you know. He would have locked up that money tight. He leans forward, eyes burning with curiosity. And Carrington? Well, let's just say he's in trouble, financially. He's hard up, and I wonder. Now, the stage is set. The mystery is no longer just a story. It's a dangerous game with lives at stake. Puo rises, signaling the end of the conversation. Let's go. You're intrigued. I see it in your eyes. There's a taxi stand just around the corner. Let's pay Mr. Halliday a visit. The adventure is about to begin. Scene opens with a sense of opulence and anticipation. The towering mansion on Park Lane gleams under the London lights, a symbol of immense wealth. We step inside, the air thick with mystery and anticipation. The American magnate, Mr. Halliday, has summoned us to his lavish library. The door opens and we're greeted by the imposing figure of a stout, large man with sharp, piercing eyes and a chin that juts out aggressively, as though he's always ready to take charge. Mr. Puo, Halliday booms, his voice carrying authority. I don't need to waste time. You've read the papers. You know what's at stake. I'm not the type to sit around when there's work to be done. You did good work with those bonds before. Never forget a name. He pauses for a moment, his gaze steady. I've got Scotland Yard on the case, sure, but I want my own man. Money's no object. All that I've worked for, all the dollars I've made, are for my little girl, and now she's gone. I'll spend my last cent to catch the bastard who did this. His words are sharp, filled with grief and rage. Do your job, and make sure you deliver. Puo bows with a slight nod, as if he's already immersed in the gravity of the task ahead. Of course, Mr. Halliday, he says. I'll do it all the more willingly, especially considering the history. I've seen your daughter in Paris before, many times. Now, please, tell me everything. How did she come to Plymouth? What was she really doing there? Mr. Halliday sits back, his posture tense as he relives the details, his voice growing heavier with each word. To start, he explains, Flossie wasn't supposed to go to Plymouth. She was on her way to a house party at Avonmead Court, the Duchess of Swansea's place. She left London on the 12:14 from Paddington, changing at Bristol. But the Plymouth Express, it doesn't even come close to Bristol. The 12:14 was a direct line to Bristol. It never stops there. The Plymouth Express? That's a different route entirely. Doesn't even touch Bristol. He leans forward, as though to drive the point home. Flossie traveled alone, her carriage reserved all the way to Bristol. Her maid, in third class, a few coaches back. Puo's eyes narrow with curiosity as he takes in the details. Halliday continues, his voice a mix of disbelief and sorrow. The party at Avonmead Court was meant to be a lavish affair, full of balls and glamour. Flossie took nearly all her jewels, about $100,000 worth. That was her plan. The jewels, they were her responsibility, carried in a small blue Morocco case. Puo's interest sharpens. Who handled the jewels? He asks, his voice cutting through the tension. Flossie always handled them herself, Halliday replies. Her maid, Jane Mason, took care of her bags, but Flossie was always meticulous about her jewels. The plot thickens. Puo listens intently, absorbing every word. Mr. Halliday takes a deep breath before continuing. At Bristol, the maid comes to collect her mistress's things. Flossie tells her she won't be getting off at Bristol after all. She was going farther. The maid was shocked, but Flossie told her to leave the luggage in the cloakroom and have tea in the refreshment room. She said she'd return later on an up train. But Flossie never came back. Puo interrupts, his voice like a cold gust of wind. So, what happened? Halliday nods solemnly. The maid waited for train after train, but Flossie didn't return. After the last train, Jane Mason left the luggage and went to a hotel. It wasn't until the next morning that she read about the tragedy in the papers. The body was found. And then the news hit. Puo leans in, his gaze intent on Halliday. But what about the sudden change of plans? Was there something that triggered it? Ah, Halliday says, his voice filled with uncertainty. Jane Mason said that when she arrived at Bristol, Flossie wasn't alone in her carriage. There was a man with her standing by the far window, looking out, making sure he wasn't seen. Puo's lips tighten. Was this man seen by anyone else? Halliday hesitates, then shakes his head. Number? The train was a corridor 1. Flossie was standing in the corridor when she spoke to Mason. The man? He was on the far side, out of view. Puo stands up, his gaze piercing as he straightens the inkstand, an odd, nervous tick he can't quite hide. It's strange how certain things, crooked things, affect the nerves, isn't it? But back to the point. This man, do you have any idea who he could be? Halliday's hesitation is almost palpable. Finally, he answers, his voice low. No, I don't know who he was, but he's tied to this somehow, I'm sure of it. The air is thick with mystery, the web of lies, deception, and danger drawing tighter with each word spoken. Puo's mind races with possibilities. As the pieces of the puzzle begin to fall into place, the shocking discovery of the body comes into sharper focus. She was first chloroformed, Halliday explains with a bitter edge, then stabbed. A doctor on the train confirmed it. She never stood a chance. The room falls silent, the weight of the case pressing down on everyone present. Halliday's grief is palpable, but his resolve is stronger than ever. You'll find this bastard, won't you? He demands, his voice filled with a desperate need for justice. Puo looks up, his gaze unwavering. I will. I won't rest until I do. The stakes have never been higher. The chase is on, and with every passing second the mystery of Flossie Halliday's death deepens. The truth, hidden beneath layers of deception, is about to be uncovered. The time of death is becoming clearer now. The body must have been discovered shortly after leaving Bristol, between there and West, maybe even between West and Taunton. But there's one missing piece, the jewel case. The jewels are gone. Puo leans forward, eyes sharp as ever. One more thing, Mr. Halliday. What happens to your daughter's fortune now? A long pause fills the room before Halliday speaks, his voice heavy with regret. Flossie made a will shortly after her marriage. She left everything to her husband. He hesitates, then continues, bitterness creeping in. I never trusted him. He's an unprincipled scoundrel. And, by my advice, my daughter was on the verge of freeing herself from him. I had her money secured in such a way that he couldn't touch it, not while she was alive. But despite living apart for years, she still gave in to his demands for money rather than face the scandal. Halliday's face tightens with anger. I was determined to put an end to that. Flossie agreed, and we had my lawyers start proceedings. But yesterday, her husband was in town. He came back last night. I believe he was away, but he's here now. Puo absorbs this, the wheels turning in his mind. I think I have all I need for now, he says, his gaze fixed on Halliday. But I'll need to speak to the maid, Jane Mason. The room grows tense as Halliday rings the bell. Moments later, the door opens, and in steps Jane Mason. She's a hard-featured woman, her face stoic as ever, trained to mask any emotion, especially in the face of tragedy. Puo's voice is soft but commanding. "I need to ask you a few questions about your mistress." "Of course, sir," Mason responds, her tone respectful but distant. "Was she agitated before she left yesterday?" "Oh no, sir, she was just as usual, calm, not flustered." But then, as she speaks about Bristol, her expression changes. "But at Bristol, that was different. She was upset, nervous. She didn't seem to know what she was saying." "What exactly did she say?" Puo presses. "Well, as near as I can remember, she said, 'I've got to change my plans. Something's happened. I'm not getting out here after all. I must go on, get the luggage and put it in the cloakroom. Then have some tea and wait for me.'" "Wait for you?" She said she'd return by another train? Puo asks. "Yes, sir," Mason confirms. "But I thought it was odd. It wasn't like her to make a change like that." "I didn't question her, though. I thought maybe it had to do with the gentleman in the carriage with her. She didn't speak to him, but she kept turning to him, almost as though seeking approval or confirmation, as if to ask, 'Am I doing the right thing?'" Puo's interest sharpens. "You didn't see his face?" "No, sir. He stood with his back to me the whole time," Mason says, her gaze lowering. "Can you describe him at all?" Puo presses. "He was tall and slender, wore a light overcoat and a traveling cap. His hair was dark. Only saw the back of his head," Mason recalls. Puo raises an eyebrow. "Was it your master, Mr. Carrington?" Mason looks startled by the question. "I don't think so, sir, but I'm not sure. His build was similar, but I hardly ever saw Mr. Carrington. It could have been him, I suppose. But I don't know." Puo narrows his eyes, as if considering every word. He reaches down and picks up a pin from the carpet, frowning at it with a peculiar intensity, before asking again, "Could the man have boarded the train at Bristol before you reached the carriage?" Mason thinks for a moment. "Yes, sir. The train was crowded, and it took me some time to get out. The platform was also very crowded. He could have gotten on then. But it was only for a minute or two. That was all the time he'd have had to speak to her." Puo straightens up. "Did you know what she was wearing, Mason?" "The papers gave some details, but I need confirmation." "Yes, sir," she says, her memory sharper now. "She wore a white fox fur with a white spotted veil, and a blue coat and skirt. They call it electric blue. Quite striking, sir." Puo nods thoughtfully. "That might help us narrow down the exact place where the crime happened. Anyone who saw her would remember her for sure." Halliday looks at Mason with a thank you in his eyes as she leaves the room. After she's gone, Puo stands quickly, almost briskly, his mind racing with the pieces of the puzzle now laid out before him. "That's all I can do here for now, Mr. Halliday, but please, I'll need you to tell me everything, everything, no matter how small it seems." The air was thick with tension, the kind that clings to every breath, amplifying each sound, each movement. Puo's sharp gaze bore into Halliday as though peeling back layers of his composed demeanor, searching for the secrets he so desperately wanted to conceal. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to break the unbearable silence. "Absolutely," Halliday said finally, his voice clipped, cold, and deliberate. "There is nothing more to be said. I must decline the case." The words hit like a hammer, abrupt and final, but Puo was not so easily dismissed. His brow furrowed, his posture unmoving, exuding an air of quiet authority. "Why?" he asked, his tone deceptively soft, yet laced with an edge that could cut steel. Halliday's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes flickering with an emotion that Puo couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps? Defiance? His voice, however, was firm. Because you have not been entirely frank with me." The accusation hung between them like a challenge. A heavy silence followed, thick and oppressive, as the two men stared at one another. Puo's sharp mind worked quickly, dissecting Halliday's every word, his every gesture. There was something more here, something unsaid, and Puo's instincts screamed at him not to back down. "You're keeping something back," Puo said, his voice calm, measured, but brimming with certainty. His eyes locked onto Halliday's, refusing to let him retreat into his silence. "And you know it's only a matter of time before I find out what it is." For a moment, Halliday seemed to waver, his composure faltering. Then, with a resigned sigh, he reached into his coat pocket, producing a folded piece of paper. "I suppose this is what you're after, Monsieur Puo," he said, his tone laced with reluctant acknowledgement. "Though how you knew about it is beyond me." Puo took the paper, his movements precise, almost ceremonial. He unfolded it slowly, his fingers brushing against the textured parchment as though handling a relic of great importance. His eyes scanned the text quickly, his expression giving nothing away. Then, with deliberate intent, he began to read aloud, his voice steady, his accent lending the words an almost poetic weight. "Madame, it is with infinite pleasure that I look forward to the felicity of meeting you again after your most amiable reply to my letter. I can hardly restrain my impatience. I have never forgotten those days in Paris. It is most cruel that you should be leaving London tomorrow. However, before very long, and perhaps sooner than you think, I shall have the joy of beholding once more the lady whose image has ever reigned supreme in my heart. Believe me, madame, all the assurances of my most devoted and unaltered sentiments, Aron de Roure." The words dripped with sentimentality, a romantic fervor that felt entirely out of place in the cold, clinical atmosphere of the room. Yet Puo didn't miss the undercurrent of urgency, the subtle desperation hidden beneath the flowery prose. As he finished, Puo lowered the letter, his eyes narrowing as he studied Halliday's reaction. "Aron de Roure," he repeated, the name lingering on his tongue like a bitter aftertaste. Quite the devoted admirer, it seems. But what, I wonder, does this love letter have to do with Flossy Carrington's tragic death? Halliday's face paled, his mask of calm slipping for the briefest of moments before he quickly regained his composure. "That," he said stiffly, "is something you'll have to uncover yourself. My part in this is finished." Puo's lips curved into a faint smile, sharp, knowing, dangerous. "We'll see about that." The tension in the room thickened once more, but Puo remained unshaken. With each step, the pieces of the puzzle were drawing closer together, the truth becoming clearer. But the shadows around this case were deep, and he knew the danger was far from over. Somewhere, in the tangled threads of lies, secrets, and desperate acts, the true culprit was lurking, and Puo would stop at nothing to bring them to light. Puo paused for a moment, handing the letter back to Halliday with a small bow. "I fancy, Mr. Halliday, that you didn't know your daughter intended to renew her acquaintance with the Count de Rosu." Halliday's face turned pale, his eyes flickering with shock. "That letter," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found this in my daughter's handbag. This so-called Count is an adventurer of the worst kind." Puo gave a slight nod. "And yet, you've been holding something back, haven't you?" Halliday's eyes narrowed as he looked up. "I don't understand. How did you know about this letter?" Puo smiled enigmatically. "I didn't, but my dear Halliday, tracking footprints and recognizing cigarette ash is not enough for a detective. A true detective must also be a keen psychologist." He leaned in closer. "I knew you mistrusted your son-in-law, and rightly so. He benefits from your daughter's death. The maid's description of the mysterious man matches him, yet you haven't been eager to pursue that trail." Halliday's face flickered with unease. "Then why this letter?" It unsettled me horribly. The Count speaks of seeing her again before very long. He clearly wouldn't wait for you to catch wind of his reappearance. Was it he who traveled down from London, caught the 12:14, and entered the carriage to speak with your daughter?" The millionaire hesitated, but then nodded slowly. "The Count, he is tall and dark, just like the man in the maid's description." Puo's mind was already a step ahead. "And the jewels? Do you know where they are now?" Halliday looked uncertain. "Inspector has a list of them. He's checking the usual places, but—" Puo's expression softened slightly. "Aye, the jewels will surface eventually. But I assume you have a list of suspects." "Well, I do, and Scotland Yard is keeping an eye on Carrington," Halliday said, his tone dismissive. "We're tracking all the regular spots." Puo's lips curled into a wry smile. "You're always a step behind, my friend, but keep at it. I'm off to Paddington now. Bristol, Weston, Taunton, those are my beats today." Halliday chuckled, despite himself. "You'll keep us informed, of course?" "Of course," Puo said, already moving toward the door. "But remember, the journey is as important as the destination. You may find the answers you're looking for just a step ahead." As the inspector departed, Puo's last words lingered in the air. The good inspector believes in motion, but sometimes it's the stillness that reveals the truth. With every step Puo takes, the truth inches closer, yet so many layers remain hidden. Will the Count's past catch up with him, or is there another shadowy figure waiting to emerge? As Puo makes his way toward the next clue, the mystery deepens, and the stakes grow ever higher. Footprints, mud, cigarette ash, you know how it is. He's busy. Too busy, really. Zealous beyond words, Puo remarked with a wry smile. "And if I were to mention psychology to him, do you know what he'd do?" He paused for effect, leaning back in his chair. "My friend," he'd smile, then say to himself, "Poor old Puo. He ages, he grows stale. The younger generation is knocking at the door." Puo chuckled softly, tapping the edge of his coffee cup. "They're knocking so hard that they fail to notice the door's already open." His friend raised an eyebrow. "And what will you do about it?" Puo gave a mischievous grin. "What can I do? I shall spend exactly 3 pence ringing up the Ritz where our Count is staying. If, of course, you didn't notice. He's staying there. After that, as my feet are a little damp and I've sneezed twice, I'll retire to my rooms and brew myself a nice cup of Tanno over the spirit lamp." The following morning, I found Puo leisurely finishing his breakfast. "Well?" I asked eagerly. "What's happened?" "Nothing," Puo replied calmly, his eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "I have not seen him yet, but the Count, he left the Ritz the day before yesterday, the day of the murder." I blinked, the realization dawning on me. "Then that settles it. Rert Carrington is cleared." Puo gave a small, thoughtful shake of his head. "You're jumping to conclusions. We mustn't be too hasty. Yes, the Count left the Ritz, but that doesn't clear anyone." He smiled, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "He must still be followed, apprehended. But the question is, why kill her? Why not just take the jewels?" "Perhaps $100,000 worth of jewels is a good enough motive for anyone," I suggested, still piecing the puzzle together. Puo tapped his fingers on the table. "No, mon ami. The question isn't about the jewels, but why kill her when she wouldn't have prosecuted? You see, she was a woman. She once loved him, perhaps still did, and would have suffered her loss in silence. The Count, a very astute man when it comes to women, would know that perfectly. I stared at him, considering his words. Then, what if it was Bert Carrington who killed her? Why take the jewels? Wouldn't that incriminate him? Puo smiled slyly. Ah, perhaps. A blind, my friend. A diversion. Clever, don't you think? Before I could respond, there came a knock at the door. Puo's eyes twinkled. Ah, here he is. I recognize that knock, he said with a grin. The door opened, and the inspector entered, beaming with good humor. Morning, Puo. Just got back. Done some good work. Puo, ever calm, barely shifted in his seat. Ah, yes. Good work, I'm sure, he replied, a small smile curling his lips. Under his breath, he added, Getting on in years, I see. The inspector laughed heartily. Always the joker, eh? You'll want to hear what I've done, I'm sure. Let me guess, Puo interjected smoothly. You've found the knife, the one used in the crime, right? By the side of the line between Weston and Taunton. And you've interviewed the paper boy who spoke to Mrs. Carrington at Weston? The inspector's jaw dropped. How on earth did you know that? Puo leaned back, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Don't tell me it was those almighty little gray cells of yours, the inspector said, recovering his composure. Ah, I'm glad you finally admit their might, Puo replied, his tone light. So, tell me, did Mrs. Carrington give the boy a shilling? The inspector paused. Number half a crown, actually. Puo raised an eyebrow. A half-crown. Rather extravagant for an American, don't you think? The inspector's mood shifted. Yes, but that's not the interesting part. The boy didn't forget her. Not a bit. She hailed him and bought 2 magazines, one with a picture of a girl in blue. She remembered her cover perfectly, Puo mused, his eyes narrowing as he pieced together the clues. And that was enough for me. I stared at him, processing his words. So, you know how the crime was committed? By the doctor's evidence, the crime must have happened before Taunton, he continued, eyes gleaming. I figured they'd throw the knife away at once, so I walked down the track looking for it. And there it was. I was beginning to see the picture come together. And when you went to Taunton? The station's large, you know. I didn't expect anyone to notice him. He probably caught a later train back to London. But here's the twist. When I got back, I found something interesting. The jewels are being passed around. That large emerald? It was pawned last night by one of the regulars. Who? I asked, intrigued. Red Nari, Puo replied. Ever heard of him? I frowned. No, who's that? Ah, a particularly sharp jewel thief, and not someone who shies away from murder. He usually works with a woman, Gracie Kidd, but she's not involved this time unless she skipped off to Holland with the rest of the loot. I leaned forward. And Nari? You've arrested him? Sure thing, Puo confirmed. But the man we're really after is the one who accompanied Mrs. Carrington on that train. He's the mastermind. Nari won't squeal on him, though, not a chance. A flash of excitement sparkled in Puo's eyes as he added, But I have an idea. A little plan. And I think I can help you catch Nari's accomplice. I raised an eyebrow. At your age, I'm curious. What's the plan? Puo smiled, his expression both mischievous and satisfied. Devil's own luck, my friend. I'm sure it'll work out. Perhaps not. He winked. Now, Hastings, my hat and brush, please. Let's not undo the good work of that Tanno. As we hailed a taxi, Puo gave the driver directions to Park Lane. Once we arrived at Halliday's house, Puo's movements were swift and precise. He paid the driver and led me inside, his presence calm, yet electric with purpose. The footman ushered us upstairs, where we were taken to a neat bedroom at the top of the house. Puo's eyes scanned the room, then locked onto a small black trunk. Without a word, he knelt in front of it, carefully inspecting the labels. He pulled a small twist of wire from his pocket and began to work on the lock. "Mr. Halliday, will you please join me here?" Puo called over his shoulder to the footman. "I need to make sure everything is in order." The footman left, and Puo continued with his task. As he coaxed the lock open with practiced hands, the anticipation in the room grew thick. Moments later, the lock gave way, and Puo lifted the trunk's lid with ease. He started rifling through the clothes inside, flinging them aside with urgency. Then, heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs, and Halliday entered the room, his face a mixture of confusion and fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, eyes wide as he saw Puo sifting through his belongings. Puo smiled serenely. "Looking for this." From the trunk, he pulled out a bright blue coat and skirt, along with a small stole of white fox fur. Just then, a woman entered the room, her entrance as sudden as it was revealing. "What are you doing with my trunk?" she demanded. Puo turned to her, a glint of recognition flashing across his face. "Allow me to introduce you to Grace Kidd, also known as Jane Mason. She'll soon be rejoining her accomplice, Red Nari, under a rather interesting escort." A deprecating hand waved dismissively as Puo helped himself to more caviar. "It's not every day one lunches with a millionaire," he mused, the quiet smugness in his voice a mark of his satisfaction. But something was gnawing at me. It was the maid's insistence on the clothes her mistress had been wearing that first triggered my suspicion. Why was she so eager for us to focus on the attire? I reflected on the facts. We only had the maid's word for the mysterious man spotted in the carriage at Bristol. As per the doctor's findings, Mrs. Carrington could have easily been murdered before reaching Bristol. But if that was the case, then the maid had to be an accomplice. And if she were in on it, why would she want us to rely solely on her testimony? The clothes Mrs. Carrington was wearing were too distinctive to ignore. A maid generally has a say in her mistress's wardrobe choices, but this seemed deliberate. If anyone, after Bristol, saw a woman in a bright blue coat and fur, they'd immediately identify her as Mrs. Carrington. It all clicked into place. I began to piece it together. The maid had likely provided herself with duplicate clothes, probably a near-perfect replica. She and her accomplice, whoever he was, had murdered Mrs. Carrington between London and Bristol, most likely using the cover of a tunnel. Her body was hidden under the seat, and the maid took her place in Weston, ensuring she was noticed. How? By picking a newspaper boy to impress. She'd give him a large tip and draw his attention to the color of her dress, perhaps mentioning one of the magazines she bought. After Weston, she would dispose of the murder weapon, throwing the knife out of the window to mark where the crime had happened, then change into new clothes or don a long mac to cover up the evidence. At Taunton, she leaves the train, returns to Bristol, and picks up the luggage her accomplice had left behind. With a ticket in hand, he returns to London while she stays behind, playing her part perfectly. The next morning, she resumes her journey, returning to London as if nothing had happened. I awaited confirmation, and when Puo returned from his investigation, he had it. All my deductions were spot on. What's more, a well-known crook had been spotted passing the jewels. I knew immediately that whoever it was would be the complete opposite of the man Jane Mason had described. When I heard it was Red Nari, always working with his partner Gracie Kidd, I knew exactly where to find her. And the Count? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. He had nothing to do with the murder. That man was far too cautious to risk everything on a reckless crime. It wasn't in his character. "Well, Miss Puo," Halliday said, his voice tinged with gratitude. "I owe you a huge debt. The check I write after lunch won't come close to settling it." Puo smiled modestly and whispered to me, "He'll get his official credit, of course, but as the Americans say, I think I've got his goat."